Hey, welcome back to Fish Out Northwest. We are now back in the bait lab. We are going to talk a little bit of tributary springer fishing. This is literally one of my favorite times of the year, albeit this year we have a pretty lackluster preseason forecast and we have very few tributaries open. That being said, there are a couple of them and we need to take advantage of that. So one of my favorite ways to go about it, especially if I plan to leave the pontoon or the drift boat at home, is I'm just going to simply go bank fishing and bounce from hole to hole and try to find those areas where those fish might hold up. Now, we could get into a lot of details on water levels and clarity and where you're going to find those fish, but for the most part, I'm going to give you generalities on how to rig, at least how I like to rig, so that you can, oh, that's a good point there, Dave. We should probably turn some lights on. So while he fumbles with the lights, we're going to continue to stamp on through this. So bobber and bait fishing for springers is a great approach in that these things, though they can be finicky, you can entice them to bite. And with good bait, eggs in combination with shrimp, and of course, I didn't line it up out here, but I use a host of scents. I will have 5 or 6 different Atlas Mike scents with me, and we're talking sardine oil, sand shrimp oil, tuna is a definite go-to, herring, and mackerel. There's a number of different oily based scents that you really want to use on your baits that are going to make a difference. So having good bait is important. Having good fresh sand shrimp is important, and don't be afraid to use a decent sized glob of eggs with a good half a sand shrimp or so. Really put a lot of scent. Now I always advocate, if you have a tray of eggs, that you don't take a single scent and just simply squeeze that oil all over your eggs, okay? You want to take it, believe it or not, it's very methodical in your approach. Cut off a piece of egg, put it in your egg loop, put in a piece of shrimp, add a couple drops of whatever scent you're choosing to utilize. That way, that particular bait that you're fishing has a certain type of scent to it. The next bait that you put on, you may put a sand shrimp on with it, and you may grab your tuna oil, or you may grab your herring oil. My point is, you never want to just show up with a single scent covering your bait, or just one recipe of eggs and sand shrimp and think you're going to be successful as springers. You could knock the heck out of them on one day with a certain combination, go back the next day, they don't even want to touch it. They don't even give it a sniff, and you have fish rolling in the hole. So always set yourself up for success. Spend a few extra bucks. Bring 2 or 3, 4 different types of oil scent with you that you can put on your bait. Okay, with that, we're talking about floats. We're talking about single hook, dual hook. Do I use monofilament? Do I use braid? The bottom line is, for me, when it comes to Chinook fishing, typically now for fall Chinook, I like to use something like this Lamiglas G1000. It's a 10.5 foot rod, 10 to 20. Now 10 to 20 rod actually is a little heavy in some cases for springers, although it's not overkill. I could fish this rod all day very comfortably, and I know that I can really put some pressure to these fish and get them in. Nothing wrong with a 10.5 foot, 10 to 20. I'll fish it all day, but I can go a little lighter, and I'm going to talk about these other rods here in a minute. Standard rigging for me on my Chinook fishing. Okay, so we've made that clear. We got a 10.5 foot rod. I like a bait caster setup. That reel just happens to have about a 22 to 25 pound drag, so that's a good thing to have for Chinook because these are big, strong fish. Because I'm fishing a bait caster, I go with a braid that is at least 40 or 50 pound on my braid. And those that have heard me give this spiel before, more so because if I do get hung up and I pull and break off, it likes to bury that braided line down into your spool. If you have a 30 pound braid on there, I guarantee it's going to bury that stuff down into that spool relatively deep. It's going to be hard to get it out of there. So I like the durability, the abrasion resistance, castability, the floatability, all those things have a larger diameter, and I like the way it stays out of the spool when I do get hung up. So 40 or 50 pound braid is what I spool up with. I'll put on about a 20 pound, depending on time of year, water clarity and whatnot. I always fish a monofilament top shot tied to my braid, and I will run that 12 to 18 feet, which is easy because it's simply arm lengths, okay? So I'll go 3 arm lengths, 18 feet or so of monofilament, knotted onto my braid. That is my travel line for where my float goes. I'm going to use that monofilament as my line that goes down in the water. In my mind, the braid floats on top. From the stopper of your float down underneath your float is monofilament, and it's going to sink, okay? You don't necessarily need to use fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon's a little heavier. it definitely sinks, but we don't need to go to fluorocarbon unless we get into that June time conditions, extremely clear, fish are very finicky or there's not many of them around, and you're trying to be uber stealthy. And then you're going to want to bump that up to 20, 25 pound fluorocarbon just for the abrasive resistance, and that is going to be a durable line that fishes well. If you have to go to fluorocarbon, I always go a little heavier. If I'm fishing monofilament as my top shot for springers, I might get away with a 15 pound ultra green, for example, because that's a very tough line. It's going to be durable. It's going to fish well. They really can't see it unless that water gets gin clear and we're talking warmer conditions in June. Okay, something to think about. So we put that top shot on. Now, as far as the rigging goes, here's our bobber stop. If you can barely see that, it's quite small. It's a Bomag egg rubber stop. Love these things. They grab really well on monofilament. That is my depth setter for my sliding float. So on top of my float, I put an indicator corky or a bead or a fish pill, something that just helps me identify when this float is in the water and it slides all the way through the line to the stopper. I know that that float is at the very maximum of my adjustment because it is, I can see that the bead has stopped on top of my float. It's just an easier way. If you have a little distance, you're looking out across the water, you'll see that that is stopped against the stopper for sure, and you know that you're fishing the depth that you've set that at. So I got my stopper, I have my bead or my, I like to use that larger indicator, something I can see. These old eyes, of course. This is a 3/4 ounce float, and that just simply continues to go down here on my main line. I put a bead underneath that main line. I also will put a rubber bobber stop just below that bottom bead, right above the knot of my inline weight. Now the reason for that, two reasons actually. One, if I do hang up my leader and break off, typically if for some reason this knot decides to fail on the top end, if this knot on my main line decides to fail, more times than not, I'm not going to lose that float because it'll stop against this extra egg stop. Now, yeah, you're burning an extra egg stop to get that done, but it's a lot cheaper investment on that egg stop against your inline weight than giving up a $7 float. So I put that right down against the knot. That bead comes down and stops against the bobber stop, and the float, of course, would simply come down and rest against this. So when I'm casting, everything is down at the bottom end, okay? And I reel up the main line as far as I need to. That upper bobber stop passes through the guides. It's not an issue. And that's how we set our depth. The top one stops the travel, and that is how we set our depth. The other thing you could do if you wanted to, for whatever reason, you wanted to fish a fixed float, I could literally side this bottom one up to just underneath that float. Now, that float is fixed on my main line. By having a stopper on each end, that is not going to travel. If I had a need or reason to fish a fixed float, I can simply do that by sliding that stopper up. Okay, they make it really easy. 3/4 ounce float, 5/8 inline, sinker, swiveled on both sides. Simply tie that in line. Again, we're fishing a vertical presentation, so when everything is vertical in the water, I like the weights to be right underneath it. I don't like to use a snap swivel or anything and, excuse me, and hang a small cannonball or, I mean, it's your preference. You can do what you want. I like everything vertical, straight up and down. That is going to go then right to my leader. Now, oftentimes we talk about a midpoint weight on our leader. We're fishing about a 20-inch to 24-inch leader, okay? The weight is above that substantially, a couple feet above my hooks. Your bait can be somewhat buoyant. You cure your eggs in salts and sugars. It can make them a little buoyant or neutral buoyant, and they can be slow to drop into the area that you're fishing. So we like to put in a midpoint weight. Now, years ago, simply crimping on a split shot or adding some type of weight to that midpoint was an option. But anymore, I simply like to take this 1/16 hollow core that I use for stick leads, and I put another bobber stop midpoint on my leader. In most rules and regulations, if you look, your weight has to be 12 inches away from your hooks. Okay, so I make sure we're a good 12, 14 inches away from the hooks. And this is adjustable. I can move that little knot around, but I just simply take this very low profile sliding piece of hollow core and let that rest right against that. And you'd be amazed at, that's maybe about an inch long, and it weighs about a quarter ounce. And that does a tremendous job in getting your presentation down, especially if you have a little faster moving water. If you're fishing the head of a hole and that water's moving through pretty fast at the top end, it's the time of year where those springers, they like to tuck their nose up into the top end of that hole because they're getting that oxygenated water. They feel a little safer, especially on a sunny day, a sunny morning. They may tuck up into the upper end of that hole. Now, if you're fishing a 3/4 ounce float and a 5/8 ounce weight and you don't have a midpoint weight on there, you're going to throw that presentation up above that stuff and sweep it through the hole. Problem is, your weight and everything will start sinking. Your bait may be delayed as it pendulums on down through and gets completely vertical as then it moves through the hole. So what you've done is you bypassed all the fish at the top end of the hole, and by the time you're actually vertical and at depth of fishing that position, you might be past where the fish are tucked up in there. So having a midpoint weight's going to get it done. Having a low profile like this ensures also that it's very snag resistant. I very seldom get hung up if I find myself fishing something a little shallower than I anticipated. I very seldom get hung up with that little sliding low profile weight on there. Now you could use an egg sinker. You could still do the old standby of crimping a split shot onto your leader, but for me that puts a little bit of damage to that leader. It makes a weak point and it makes a failure point is what it ultimately does. So a sliding weight on there, the edges get rounded off. It's not an issue. It stops against that stopper and it gives you a midpoint weight that's going to get your presentation down. I like to use a double hook setup where it's approved, and you can do so. This is a 3/0 and a 1/0 stinger hook. Now I like to use a 3/0. I tie a nice big egg loop on there. You can put a decent size amount of eggs into that loop, and you still have the luxury of having that full-on size 1 or 1/0 hook below completely exposed. Okay, so give yourself about a finger width in between those two is typically what's going to get it done for you. At the bend of the hook to the eye of the stinger hook, you want about 1 finger width, and that will completely stay below or outside of your bait. That's going to definitely improve or increase your hookup to land ratio. Okay, so basically we're talking about a vertical presentation, and everything for me is completely vertical, from the float to the inline sinker, to the beads that I put in line here. Remember to put that little bobber stop underneath if you want to save your float. Straight in line, I put that midpoint weight simply by using that other bobber stop in a dual hook setup. Very easy to fish, very easy to adjust your depth. If you move from hole to hole, especially if you're bank fishing, or even if you're in a drift boat because you're covering water, it's very simple to, well, I'll just let that sit out there. Very simple to adjust that depth of that bobber up and down depending on the depth of your hole. Now, that was the 10 to 20 pound rod. Real quickly before we get done here, talk about a couple other options. This is a 10.5 foot rod. This is a Northwest rods by my buddy Dave. Really nice rod, 10.5 foot, 8 to 17 bait caster, okay? Have a little bit of smaller, low profile reel on here. Not as high as a drag break on here, but nonetheless still a good enough reel to get it done. The difference here, and I just happen to have this rigged up this way, not saying that you have to or don't have to on a lighter rod, but you could rig this exactly vertical like I just did. This one happens to be rigged up for a bobber dogging setup, and if you think you can't bobber dog for springers, then you are mistaken. So bobber dogging for springers is another good way to put that bait or presentation in front of them. Remember, when we're bobber dogging, we're not in a vertical presentation. That's why my weight is not in line with my presentation. This is set up as any bobber dogging rig with a bobber dogging float, with the flat back to it that the surface current is pushing it down river. The weight is dragging on the bottom. Our bobber stop is set 6, 8, 10 feet up the main line to allow the float to travel until it hits the stopper. Once it hits the stopper, it's pointing down river. The weight's dragging. And if you want, you don't have to. You can fish just bait. Okay, this pink is kind of bright, but I put it on there so you could see it. This is a 3/0 hook, a size 1 stinger. It has a big corky on there for buoyancy because, again, we're now basically drift fishing with a float. So we're adding a little extra buoyancy in there just to keep our presentation up off the bottom. Bobber dogging works in many facets. It works well for steelhead. It works great for fall Chinook and coho, and I guarantee you it also works for springers. If you're having a hard time on a drop-off area, trying to gauge exactly how deep you should be fishing if you're suspended vertically, you know, take all that guesswork out of adjusting your float up and down. Go to a bobber dog setup. You'll start off on that shallow ledge up top. That lead is going to follow the contour of the bottom right down into there to where those fish might be tucking their noses up into that shelf, and you'll get that presentation right in front of them. So bobber dogging is another good way to go about it. Again, the biggest difference here is this lighter rod. I will fish an 8 to 17 rod for springers all day long, especially tributary springers. Not saying we can't get 20 pounders, because we have, but 8 to 17 rod is going to handle that 20-pound fish all day long. Another good choice, if you're a spinning rod, if you choose to use a spinning rod, this is the Okuma Guide Select Pro. This is another 10.5-foot rod. Really like these rods. They're light. This is an 8 to 17. I got this Bantam reel on here, or excuse me, this pin reel on here. This one is in fact set up as that vertical presentation. Once again, I got my midpoint weight on there. Dual hook. Actually, this one here I've cut down. I get the questions about when it's okay to use 2 hooks, okay? In some of our regulations, you have to really read your regs each and every year, because they will change. If it says single point barbless hooks, you're generally okay to use 2 hooks. If it says single point barbless hooks, and it has, trying to recall the extra rule that they put in the preface of your rule book, you got to look on specific rivers. There's some that we can't use dual hooks, but what you can do, because I like to have that exposed hook completely exposed when I'm fishing bait. So the old trick of tying on a tandem hook or a dual hook and simply cutting off that at the bend of your hook, leaving the main shank and the eyelet of your top hook, and then a fully exposed, this is a 3/0 hook dragging out of the bottom. But what that allows me to do is simply slide that egg loop out of there. Now I can put my bait up here in this upper holding area, and that's all that is an inline bait holder, and I still have a full hook exposed. Technically and legally, that is fishing 1 hook, and I simply have a bait holder above it. Again, when I'm fishing bait suspended under floats, I like to have a hook exposed, especially on some of these finicky biters that springers can be so particular sometimes. If you have that extra hook hanging out there completely unobstructed by bait, your hook up to land ratio goes up considerably. So that's another option. If you want to fish dual hooks, but you can't because of the legalities, simply cut that top hook at the bend, leave your bait loop, and fish that single exposed hook. So vertical presentation on this rod, again, this is that Okuma Guide Select model. Fantastic spinning rod, especially for fall salmon as well, for coho. Works great for springers. The line weight is everything that you need to handle a springer, no problem. Let's talk a little bit about float orientation before we wrap it up. Remember, we're fishing vertical. We have to have that float fishing vertical. If we are set at a certain depth and the float is pointing downriver, that means that my presentation, whether it's my bait or my weight, is dragging on bottom, and the float's going to be pointing down. So you need to bring it back in, slide your stopper down, which thereby shortens up your depth, and then cast it back out. One thing about fishing vertically is it's a great depth finder for you. If you step into a hole you haven't fished before and you set your stopper at 8 feet and you drift it through, you don't get bit. Bring it back in or drift that depth for a couple times. You don't get bit, but you think there's fish there. Slide that stopper up by a foot. Now you're going to cast it out the next time. You're going to be fishing that a foot deeper. You do that a few casts, you don't get bit. Slide it up a foot again. You do this until you make a drift through there and your bobber is pointing downriver, indicating to you that your presentation is now dragging. If you hit bottom and it's dragging, bring it back in, drop your or slide your stopper down 2 feet. I say 2 feet because now I know I'm with a foot or two of the bottom where those Chinook are going to be, and I'm definitely in the strike zone. So for that particular area that I'm fishing, I've just gauged the depth by casting out a series of times, adjusting my depth, dragging bottom, bring it back in, slide it up 2 feet. Now I've set my depth. It's going to be very effective in honing in exactly the depth that you're fishing based on unfamiliar water that you are fishing. That's how you gauge your depth, okay? So it's nice that you can adjust it any hole you step into, anywhere you fish, you can continue to play with your bobber stop up and down to make sure you're always gauging your depth. You want to be down off the bottom within a foot or two, but not dragging your bait. It has to be suspended to get Chinook. That's probably about it. We've covered weight, we've covered floats. Again, if you're fishing faster water, heads of holes, don't be afraid to step up to a 1 ounce bobber and a 3/4 ounce inline weight. If you're fishing some softer water that's not moving so fast, more times than not, especially on a 8 to 17 setup, you can get away with 3/4 ounce bobber and a 5/8 inline. Put that little stick inline midpoint weight on there, and your system is going to be rigged for success. That's going to pretty much wrap it up for us. If you have questions on anything that we talked about here today in the Bait Lab relative to tributary springer fishing, hit us up on Facebook, hit us up on YouTube, hit us with those questions. Go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. These videos will be broken out of our main show and put out there as individual how-tos, something we're going to continue to do each and every week. Okay, with that, we're going to wrap it up here. Step out for a quick commercial break. Pretty excited about this. We come back in studio, we're going to have Dave Shamp, and we're going to get into a deep discussion on hatchery and wild coexist. All that and more right here when we come back on FHN.